Hello and welcome to the Russian Empire History Podcast, the history of all the peoples of the Russian Empire. I'm your host, J.P. Bristow. This is Season 1, The Forest, the Steppe, and the Birth of the Russian Empire, and Episode 59, Big Nest and the Rest. We're on the cusp of the 13th century, where nothing much good happens for Rus. The knyaz's game of musical chairs accelerates, with people occupying and surrendering cities multiple times. Vsevolod continues to attempt to dominate the other knyazes, while the Rostislavichi and Olgovichi squabble over Kiev. In the west, there is a separate power struggle, and the western lands continue to drift away from the rest of Rus. For now, we will be glossing over that and focusing on Kiev and Susdalia, but we will revisit it when we look at the post-Rus period. When he got back to Susdalia, Vsevolod got into a dispute with the people of Novgorod. He had installed his brother-in-law, Yaroslav Vladimirovich, as knyaz, but the people of Novgorod wanted one of his sons or some other royal. Nothing about the situation is clarified in the chronicle. The people of Novgorod had previously specifically asked for Yaroslav, who appears to have been without a personal domain, and he had ruled there for 9 years. We can only assume that the reason Vsevolod was so keen to keep a Mstislavich from Volhynia in Novgorod was because he was his brother-in-law. If Yaroslav left Novgorod, Vsevolod might have felt that he had an obligation to find him another domain, and he would not have wanted to give him a chunk of Susdalia. Whatever the actual background was, Vsevolod refused to send a replacement, so Novgorod expelled Yaroslav anyway, and asked Yaroslav of Chernihiv to send a new knyaz. According to the chronicle, Yaroslav of Chernihiv sent his son, but it took 6 months for him to get there due to the Monomakhs opposing the move. He shouldn't really have bothered, as in another 6 months the city threw him out and welcomed Yaroslav Vladimirovich back. With the paucity of information in the chronicle, we're forced to guess that their real aim had been to get an actual Monomakh in charge rather than a brother-in-law, but since Vsevolod would not play along, they had to accept what they were offered. The real significance was that the whole episode undermined Vsevolod's relationship with the Olgovichi, who had proven they were quite ready to take Novgorod out of his control at the first opportunity. The following year, 1198, saw a couple of deaths with the potential to weaken Vsevolod's position. In Halych, his protege, Vladimir Yaroslavich, who had previously run into trouble over his debauchery, either drank himself to death or got poisoned. Just like the previous time this vacancy opened up, there were a lot of contenders. Roman from Vladimir in Volhynia was still interested, as was the King of Hungary. A whole bunch of the Olgovichi could make claims of varying strength based on marriages with the Osmomysil family, and there was always a chance that Rurik could assert that as Vladimir Yaroslavich had died without heirs, Halych had reverted to the disposal of the Knyaz of Kiev. Roman was both geographically the closest and the quickest off the mark. He turned to Leszek, the ruler of Little Poland, for assistance. He promised Leszek that if he helped him take Halych, he would be his ally and do whatever he wanted. Leszek seized Halych and forced the citizens to agree to accept Roman as knyaz. Roman promised the citizens that he would treat them well and that they would live together amicably. According to the chroniclers, quote, Roman kept neither promise. End quote. We heard last episode that some of Vsevolod's maneuvers had been directed towards stopping Roman becoming a rival power capable of contesting Kiev and resisting Suzdalia's influence, and now he has become such a power. Next to go was Yaroslav Mstislavich, Big Nest's nephew who had been ruling in Pereyaslavl. Pereyaslavl has rather dropped out of our story compared to its importance a couple of generations back. This was due to the rise of Suzdalia as the power base of the family which controlled it, and to the lingering effects of Polovtsi depredations 20 years earlier, which had left it too weak to play any major role militarily. Despite this, it remained important, and its previous role as a stepping stone to Kiev meant that it could potentially play a part in legitimizing a future ruler. For now, Vsevolod did not appoint a new knyaz. Vsevolod's sons were still young, but it seems that he had decided that they were ready for public life. In 1199, he finally accepted Novgorod's request, summoned Yaroslav Vladimirovich back to Suzdalia, and replaced him with his son, Sviatoslav. The following summer, he sent another son, Yaroslav, to become knyaz of Pereyaslavl. Although Yaroslav was only 10, the appointment of his son, accompanied by Posadniki advisors of course, was clearly an attempt to consolidate more direct control over these. By 1201, Roman Mstislavich of Vladimir and Volhynia had also been ruling Halych for 3 years. He had rejected all attempts at reconciliation from Rurik. He believed that Rurik had taken the 5 disputed Kiev towns from him and given them to Vsevolod because they had agreed that Vsevolod would give Torchessk to Rurik's son Rostislav. Rather than any restoration of justice based on Vsevolod's seniority, as Big Nest liked to present it, the swap was therefore a gift in exchange for a bribe. Roman's troops had sporadically been pillaging Rurik's territory ever since, and now he was ready to attack him directly. We encounter another blank spot in the chronicles here. The Rostislavichi, the Chornikhlabuki, and all the town militias of the Kiev lands joined Roman. The chroniclers tell us nothing about why they abandoned Rurik or what he had done to provoke them. No opposition is recorded in the previous years of his rule, and there are no comments on his unpopularity. Scholars see this as suggesting that it was a specific incident that caused all these allies to desert him, but we have no way of knowing for sure. The people of Kiev opened the city gates to Roman, and Rurik, along with Oleg of Chernihiv, who had not abandoned him, was left with no alternative but to surrender. The chronicles variously report that Rurik either accepted Roman's authority or renounced his claim to Kiev altogether, and then he was allowed to return to Vruchi. The chroniclers also report that Roman had notified Vsevolod of his plan to expel Rurik and received his approval. No reason is given for Vsevolod turning against Rurik either, but this is probably true because we find that Roman becomes the latest knyaz to seize Kiev without taking the throne. Instead, he and Vsevolod appoint a junior monomashchi knyaz, Ingvar Yaroslavich of Lutsk, to rule for them. Once again, we can see Vsevolod acting entirely out of self-interest. Roman had become stronger than Rurik, but was prepared to acknowledge Vsevolod as the senior knyaz, and therefore Vsevolod was happy to switch his loyalty from Rurik to Roman. Roman had a reasonably solid claim to Kiev. He was the next in line by genealogical seniority after Vsevolod and Rurik. Ingvar, whose father Yaroslav Izyaslavich had briefly held Kiev in 1173, had a claim on that basis, but was well down the pecking order and clearly meant to be Roman and Big Nest's puppet. His lack of authority was demonstrated the next winter when Roman led a campaign against the Polovtsi. Defending the Rus heartland against the Polovtsi had previously been the duty of the Knyaz of Kiev. Halich lay out of the nomads' reach and did not suffer from their raids. Roman, leading the campaign, and another one later, was a statement about who was really in charge. While Rurik might have gone home with his tail between his legs, he was just as capable of bearing a grudge as Roman. On the 2nd of January 1203, he returned with the Olgovichi and Polovtsi allies to attack Kiev. He accepted that the break with the people of Kiev, whatever had triggered it, was irreparable for now, and did not aim to retake the throne. He was here for two things. First, revenge. Second, to spite Roman. Rurik let the Polovtsi run wild. The chroniclers recorded that the devastation and cruelty was worse than anything suffered since Christianity arrived in Rus, exceeding Bogolyubsky's sack of the city in 1168. They also note that foreign merchants were spared if they forfeited half of their goods. Rurik did not want to ruin that vital trade. Once the massacre was over, Rurik had to decide who he would appoint to rule Kiev, and he chose Oleg's younger brother, Vsevolod Churny, or the Red, another junior knyaz who had a claim through his father, in this case Sviatoslav. This might seem a bit strange, since a few years earlier, Rurik had demanded that the Olgovichi all swear to give up their claims on Kiev forever, but he was working with a limited pool. His own family, the Rostislavichi, had deserted him. The Izyaslavichi of Volhynia had aligned with Roman. Oleg was too senior and independent and would have been a new rival. With the job done, Rurik returned to Vruchi. Roman seems to have drawn his own conclusions from the whole affair. He quickly sent delegations to Big Nest and Oleg of Chernihiv to conclude a peace. Then he marched on Vruchi. Rurik surrendered without battle and agreed to end his alliance with Oleg and the Polovtsi. Then Roman suggested Rurik ask for Vsevolod to aid his return to Kiev and agreed to support him. Vsevolod agreed, and Rurik was restored to Kiev. Thus, Rurik's actions ended up significantly strengthening Roman. Roman had understood that Rurik would remain a threat, especially combined with the Olgovichi and the Polovtsi, so he broke up that alliance, and then, by bringing Rurik back to Vsevolod, realigned the three branches of the monomarchs once again. Instead of a junior knyaz as puppet, Roman now controlled Rurik. With the monarchs all at peace amongst themselves, it seemed like a good time for another campaign against the Polovtsi. Roman, Rurik, Yaroslav Vsevolodovich of Pereyaslavl, and other lesser knyazes combined for a successful campaign. Once it was over, they all gathered at Trepol so that the junior knyazes could be allotted towns as a reward for their service. Here, however, their agreement came to an end. Rurik and Roman disagreed so strongly over who should get what reward that Roman seized Rurik, sent him to Kiev, had him forcibly tonsured and made a monk, forced his wife and daughters to become nuns, and sent his sons to Halych. The severity of this reaction seems to come rather out of nowhere. We see a lot of challenges, maneuvers, and standoffs, but rarely see knyazes directly assaulting each other and their families. The last time something like this happened was 150 years ago, when Iziaslav, Sviatoslav, and Vsevolod took out their uncle Sudislav. It seems clear from the circumstances that the issue was Rurik not doing what Roman told him to do. Vsevolod backed up Roman, and after a short interlude, the two of them appointed Rurik's son, Rostislav, as Knyaz of Kiev. But this created new grounds for challenges. Becoming a monk took Rurik out of the succession line, theoretically at least. Willingly or not, he had repudiated worldly things. Roman and Vsevolod did not want to rule in Kiev, and Rostislav had a claim through his father. But he was from the next generation, and that meant that there were still other claimants from the previous generation that still had a stronger claim than him. Ingvar of Lutsk, of course, and also Mstislav Romanovich of Smolensk. Rurik, becoming a monk, also released the oaths sworn to him, which meant that the Olgovichi could also claim that they were free to challenge for Kiev. Shortly after, Oleg Sviatoslavich died, and Vsevolod Chomny, who we already know is a man of ambition, became Knyaz of Chernihiv. For a couple of years, Vsevolod's military strength was enough to keep any claimants quiet. He swapped out his younger son Sviatoslav for the elder Konstantin in Novgorod, and he continued to enforce his authority as the senior knyaz among the other monomashichi. But this is Rus, and if there's one thing we have learned over the last 400 years, it's that these knyazes just can't be content with what they have. The first cracks this time came from Mstislav Romanovich of Smolensk. It's not really laid out in the chronicles, we have to read between the lines again. In March 1205, Vsevolod Big Nest's wife entered a monastery and then died. According to the chroniclers, Mstislav sent his archbishop and an igumen, something like an abbot, named Mikhail, to represent him at the funeral and negotiate either peace or forgiveness, depending on the chronicle, for conspiring with the Olgovichi. The last we heard, the parties had all been reconciled, so we have to suppose that Mstislav and Vsevolod Chomny had been disgruntled by Roman and Big Nest appointing Rurik's son to Kiev, and had got together to try to do something about it, without any real success. Next came something rather more serious. Roman Mstislavich of Halych was killed in June while fighting with the Poles. Roman had successfully campaigned to unite Volhynia and Halych, and had made himself a power among the knyazes, but he had adhered to the system of lateral succession and tried to control Kiev rather than rule it directly. Because he did not sit on the throne, his children had no claim, and so one more family dropped out of the succession line. In his own lands, his sons Daniil and Vasilko were aged just 4 and 2, clearly incapable of assuming and defending their rights to rule in Vladimir in Volhynia and Halych. The kings of Hungary and Poland, Sviatoslav Vsevolodovich, and their older cousins would soon be fighting over Halych again, and the struggle for the succession will continue until the Mongols end it in 30 years. One person in particular was glad to hear of Roman's death. Off at his monastery, Rurik quickly swapped his habit for armor and then seized Kiev. He summoned Vsevolod the Red and bought his support by offering him Halych. As the pair of them failed to take Halych, he ended up having to give him Belgorod. This was an unprecedented move. It was established that political and royal figures could become monks in old age, but they could not just return to politics. It undermined Rurik's legitimacy and meant that he was once more dependent on someone else keeping him on the throne, this time Vsevolod the Red. He also needed to appease his son for displacing him, so he gave Rostislav Vyshgorod. That meant giving Big Nest's brother-in-law, Yaroslav, the boot, and antagonizing Vsevolod. In the summer of 1206, Vsevolod Cherny took advantage of his support from Rurik and Mstislav of Smolensk to make another move for Halych. Halych appealed to Andrew II of Hungary, and a Polish army marched into Volhynia, but it did not come down to any fighting. After a standoff, the Hungarians and Poles chose to withdraw, and Halych accepted an Olgovich knyaz, Vladimir Igorovich. On the way home, though, Vsevolod Cherny betrayed Rurik and occupied Kiev. Rurik fled back to Vruchi once again. Although this seems like straight treachery, the consensus in the chronicles is that Vsevolod did this because it was improper for Rurik to rule as a monk. While this may have given him a legitimate cover, it shook up the relationship among the knyazes once again. For good measure, Red expelled Big Nest's son Yaroslav from Pereyaslavl and installed his own son, Mikhail. This left an interesting situation. Vsevolod Cherny had to let the forces he had assembled for the Halych expedition go home, while Rurik continued to attack him in Kiev, but neither of them could rely on the people of Kiev for support. Rurik based on his personal history, Vsevolod because he was an Olgovich. Vsevolod had tried to get around this by relying on the support of Mstislav Romanovich in Belgorod and Rurik's son Rostislav in Vyshgorod, but Rostislav seems not to have shared Vsevolod's feelings about monks ruling, and he supported his father. Vsevolod was forced to abandon Kiev, and Rurik retook the throne. He ordered Mikhail Vsevolodovich to leave Pereyaslavl, but he gave it to his younger brother Vladimir instead of returning it to Big Nest. There would be no reconciliation yet. In early 1207, Vsevolod Cherny made a probing attack on Kiev with just Olgovichi troops and some Polovtsi. Rurik easily fended them off around Kiev, and they pillaged the lands on the way home. But this seems to have just been a feint. Vsevolod took his main forces the long way around, and instead of attacking from the north, the direct route, he caught Rurik by surprise with an attack from the south. Rurik once again fled to Vruchi and Vsevolod. At this point, Vsevolod Big Nest decided it was time to get involved in southern Rus again. This time, he was not supporting anyone's claim to Kiev. He was accusing Vsevolod Cherny of taking Monomach domains that the Olgovichi had no right to rule, particularly Pereyaslavo. Big Nest assembled his forces, including a Novgorod contingent led by his son Constantine, forces from Pskov, Ladoga, and Novi Turg, the knyazes of Murom and Ryazan with their troops. But when he joined the junior knyazes from Ryazan, they informed Vsevolod that their uncles, the rulers in Ryazan, were conspiring with the Olgovichi against him. So Big Nest headed to Ryazan instead of Chernihiv. He seized Pronsk and Ryazan, appointed his Posadniki, and threw the knyazes and their advisors into a pit. By the time that was done, it was late in the campaign season, and he returned home. Big Nest's change of direction was little reprieve for Vsevolod Cherny. As soon as he heard Big Nest was going to attack Chernihiv, Rurik gathered his forces, including Pavlovsky allies, and attacked Kiev. Vsevolod the Red had already sent most of his men to defend Chernihiv and was not capable of resisting. He fled to Chernihiv. He would make a weak attempt to return in February 1208, but that was it. His rivalry with Rurik was over. Rurik appeared to finally be secure in Kiev, but rather than settle down peacefully, he turned his attention to Halych. The succession struggle there had flared up again, with the Poles and Hungarians continuing to interfere and the knyaz regularly changing. Rurik reached an agreement with the Hungarians to expel the knyaz and install his son Rostislav in Halych, asserting his right as the knyaz of Kiev to decide the ruler of a domain left without an heir. Rostislav was installed on 4th of September 1208. A month later, he was deposed. Rurik was dead. Although you get used to the chroniclers missing important information, it's still sometimes surprising what they choose not to include. Rurik has been one of the main figures in the chronicles for decades, but only a couple of the chronicles bothered to note that he had died in Kiev, apparently without suspicious circumstances. His age was not certain, but he must have been in his 70s. We're not told where he was buried. The chronicler's priorities make it difficult to assess the knyazes of this era. By the end of his life, the way he keeps alternately seizing Kiev and then running away to Vruchi starts to get comical. But outside of that, what did he achieve? Was he a good ruler? Who knows? He acknowledged Vsevolod Big Nest's seniority, even if he could not manage to maintain good relations with him, and he was loyal to the rest of the Rostislavichi and his vassals. However, he failed to secure the Rostislavichi's control of Kiev against Olgovichi claims, and did nothing to end the chaotic instability in Rurik's death leaves us with the two hostile Vsevolods as the leading knyazes, and Vsevolod Cherny returns to the throne of Kiev unopposed. But as always, when one knyaz dies, another one pops up to replace him. While Big Nest was busy in Ryazan, Mstislav Mstislavich, who Vsevolod Cherny had expelled from Belgorod, turned up in Novgorod. Mstislav, who acquired the name Udatny, or the Bold, marched on Novgorod in the winter of 1208, seized Vsevolod's son Sviatoslav and his officials, and sent a statement to the people reminding him that his father had ruled them and saying that he had come to save them from the violence of the Suzdalian knyazes. The people responded by welcoming to the city with honor and inviting him to be their knyaz. Sviatoslav was imprisoned to see what would happen with Big Nest. Big Nest was not ready to accept this state of affairs, and he reacted in the way that had always worked for him before. He threatened them with force. He seized the Novgorodian merchants in Suzdalia and confiscated their goods. Mstislav, though, was ready to show while he was called the Bold. He assembled his troops and marched on Torzhok, ready to take the fight to Big Nest. Vsevolod sent Konstantin, Yuri, and Yaroslav to meet the threat, but first to carry a message. You are a son to me, and I am a father to you. Release Sviatoslav and those you have imprisoned, and I will release the Novgorodian merchants and their goods. Mstislav did not accept Vsevolod's declaration of seniority, but he was prepared to release Sviatoslav and reach an agreement. As a minor prince under Rurik, Mstislav had been just another Rostislavich of no note. The death of Rurik left him without many options in the south, and seizing Novgorod propelled him to prominence, as well as strengthening the Rostislavichi. He was now the leader of the anti-Suzdalia party, and Big Nest had lost control of Novgorod, as well as Pereyaslavo. Back in Kiev, Vsevolod was feeling fairly comfortable. Rurik's death left Mstislav of Smolensk as the senior Rostislavich, and the two had already been allies, even if Mstislav had more recently supported Rurik. There was no Rostislavich with a strong claim to challenge Vsevolod, so it would seem that he had the opportunity to reconcile with Big Nest and the Rostislavich. Red gave Big Nest some time to let the Ryazan situation settle, and then, in 1210, sent the Metropolitan, Matvey, to carry a peace proposal to Suzdalia. We've already seen that Big Nest was not interested in disputing Churumli's claim to Kiev, so there was no real impediment to peace. Vsevolod Churumli acknowledged Big Nest's seniority, returned Pereyaslavo, and declared that he would not conspire against him with Ryazan. Big Nest released Churumli's daughter Vera, who he had captured in Ryazan, and betrothed his son Yuri to Churumli's daughter Agafia. They were married in Vladimir in April 1211. From Dolgoruki to Bogolyubsky to Big Nest, the key to Suzdalian strength has been its unity. Although there had been succession disputes, each new knyaz had quickly consolidated his position and maintained that strength. But with Vsevolod being named Big Nest due to the size of his family, worrying signs were starting to appear for the aging ruler. He called Konstantin back from Rostov so that he could give him Vladimir on the Klezmer and give Rostov to Yuri. Konstantin refused to go and demanded both towns. Vsevolod summoned him again. Konstantin refused again. So Vsevolod summoned all his boyars, his bishop and his prominent churchmen, leading merchants and the common people, and had them pledge allegiance to Yuri, his second son. Then he gave Vladimir to Yuri and instructed him to care for his brothers. Besides angering Konstantin as much as you would expect, this disposition broke the rules of succession. While Vsevolod might have had the authority to carry it off, once he is dead, Yuri will be a different matter. Problems for Vsevolod came from a familiar direction, Halych. As mentioned, the Igorovichi branch of the Olgovichi had been ruling there, although there continued to be numerous pretenders. After an attempted rebellion by boyars supporting one of these pretenders, the Igorovichi executed 500 of them, an incident that the chroniclers treat as unusual and extreme cruelty. The result is that the Vsevolod of Volhynia, who had been disunited and whose chief claimant to Halych was Daniil Romanovich, a 10-year-old boy, united to challenge the Igorovichi. First, they captured Sviatoslav Igorovich in Peremyshl. Then they captured Roman Igorovich, who had been ruling in Zvenigorod, and a younger brother, Rostislav. Vladimir Igorovich, who had been ruling in Halych, fled. The boyars of Halych switched their loyalty to Daniil, and the Hungarians also supported him. The people of Halych took the three captured Igorovichi and hanged them. Now, this is obviously a bit more flagrant than the maybe he was poisoned type assassinations of knyazes we've previously seen, and more deliberate than accidentally suffocating in a pit. The Olgovichi took it as an unforgivable insult, and Vsevolod declared that there would be reprisals. However, it seems like he was actually playing a bit of a game. Rather than challenging the people of Halych, who did the hanging, or Daniil and the Rostislavichi, he accused some minor Rostislavichi knyazes who held towns in the Kiev lands and expelled them. It appears that Chumny was feeling strong with his new alliance with Big Nest and thought it was time to put the Rostislavichi in their place. The three evicted Rostislavichi, Vladimir Rurikovich, Konstantin and Mstislav Davidovichi, asked Mstislav Udatny and Mstislav Smolensk to defend them. Udatny asked the people of Novgorod to march with him, and they agreed. For a while it looked like the people of Novgorod would be as little help as usual. When they got to Smolensk, Udatny acknowledged Mstislav Romanovich as the senior Rostislavich, and the Novgorodians got in a huff about taking second place to anyone and went home. Udatny and his druzhina stayed and set off south. The Novgorodians were shamed by this, and after discussions they decided to rejoin their knyaz. They quickly laid siege to and captured Vyshgorod, and Vsevolod lost his nerve and fled to Chernihiv. Udatny and his men entered Kiev, and the city submitted to them. Then they continued to Chernihiv and besieged it for 3 weeks. Churny was killed, and Gleb Sviatoslavich defended the city until he was forced to surrender and accept terms. Mstislav Romanovich, the senior Rostislavich, was installed as Knyaz of Kiev, and Udatny returned to Novgorod. There are some varying descriptions of these events in the chronicles that make them a little bit more interesting than just another Knyaz swap in Kiev. Some of the chronicles hold that Ingvar was installed in Kiev and Mstislav took his place only after Udatny returned to Novgorod. We have generally seen that the senior knyaz of a family leads any challenge for Kiev, and here we seem to have a different case. The junior Rostislavichi probably asked Mstislav of Smolensk for aid first, but he turned them down, so they went to Udatny instead. Udatny was well down the seniority line, so if his leadership was acknowledged, it was evidence of his personal talents and reputation. Despite this, in the campaign he followed Mstislav of Smolensk and served the family's interests. The Kiev Chronicle says that Udatny supported Ingvar as knyaz, and Ingvar had a genealogically superior claim to Mstislav of Smolensk, so it would have been correct for him to do so. Despite this, it appears that Ingvar acquiesced to his displacement by Mstislav, and he continued to support the Rostislavichi. Vsevolod Chumny's attempt to expel the Rostislavichi from the Kiev lands was a major miscalculation that saw him lose Kiev and then his life. What's more, none of the Rostislavichi are named in the coalition that supported Daniil in Halych, and we have no evidence in any chronicle that they were in fact involved. Churny seems to have simply picked them as scapegoats because it served his purpose of getting them out of the Kiev lands. Going back to the 1160s, every time an Olgovich seized Kiev, they tried to remove the Rostislavichi, without success until Vsevolod. Vsevolod must have known that he was asking for trouble, given that the Rostislavichi had already declared that they considered these towns their patrimony, but he appears to have thought that his alliance with Big Nest made him strong enough to take on the Rostislavichi. Unfortunately for him, when Udatny marched out south towards Kiev, Vsevolod Big Nest was already dead. Vsevolod had ruled Susdalia for 36 years, expanding its territory and influence and continuing the building of churches, monasteries, and fortified towns his brother and father had begun. He was undoubtedly the dominant knyaz of his era, and by some accounts the first to take Veliki Knyaz, usually rendered Grand Prince, as his official title, although the phrase had been used occasionally to refer to the Knyaz of Kiev unofficially. He continued Susdalia's run of development, culturally, politically, and militarily. He eliminated any threats to his rule from within his own family and neighboring knyazhestvos, consistently enforced recognition of his seniority among the monomachs, and forced the Olgovichi to submit to his influence as well. Until this time, churches in Rus had been built of wood or brick. Susdalia had white limestone in the Kama region that became the standard building material, first for churches, then for fortifications. Vsevolod had the impressive Cathedral of the Assumption built in Vladimir, still using Byzantine craftsmen, which became the seat of the Bishop of Vladimir Suzdal and an important ecclesiastical center in coming centuries. Vsevolod's wife, Maria, also sponsored the construction of a number of important monasteries and the gathering and creation of noted icons. He was not successful in everything. He continued the war against the Bulgars for control of the Volga that Andrei Bogolubsky had started, but was unable to secure Rus control of the river. He also lost ground to the Bulgars in the rivalry for influence over the Mordva tribes, and, of course, he lost control of Novgorod. Like other successful and influential knyazes, he had achieved his success by ruling a unified knyazhestvo where he was the ultimate power. But like those other knyazes, he drew no conclusions from this, and at his death he gave each of his sons a patrimony. He had ruled Vladimir Suzdal and Rostov, but he would be the last knyaz of Vladimir to rule the whole of the northeast. We are reaching the end of the story of Rus, the group of medieval kingdoms, but not of the Rus, the people. In the next episode of the main narrative, we will see the first Mongol invasion. But before we get to that, we need to expand our context. Coming up first, we have a special episode introducing the Mongols, and we will catch up on events in the Baltic, the Crusades, and meet the Hanseatic League. A very important event for the future of Russian history took place during Vsevolod's reign that we have not mentioned, as Rus has been obsessed with internal affairs all this time. In 1204, the Fourth Crusade sacked Constantinople, a shocking event that laid the foundations for a genuine schism between Eastern and Western Christians. The Novgorod Chronicle recorded the attack on Constantinople in detail, but it would be nearly 2 decades before the impact was really felt in Rus. In 1222, Pope Honorius III will order the closing of all Orthodox churches in lands controlled by the Latins, enshrining the idea that there is only one correct form of Christianity. Soon after, the Latin Crusaders in the Baltic will begin closing the Russian churches in the towns they conquer, turning the crusade into a campaign against the Orthodox as well as pagans, and meaning the Rus face new enemies from both east and west. Thank you for listening, and until next time, goodbye.